My name is Arslan Kahnemoipur. I'm Associate Professor of Linguistics at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another exciting rendition of our lectures, monthly lectures in the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali series of Iranian languages and linguistics lecture series, which I'm co-convening with my colleague, Professor Azita Talaqani from the University of Toronto, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but she's going to join us later, hopefully midway through Jeff's talk, because she had a university commitment she had to attend. And my other colleague, Professor Eric Ananbi, who's here. Eric is from Carleton University. We are very grateful for the critical support of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies and its director, who's also here, Professor Mohammad Tawakkoli Targhi, and all the sponsoring academic units, including Department of Middle and Near Eastern Civilizations and Department of Linguistics and the Department of Language Studies, all at the University of Toronto, as well as collaboration with Carleton University, and also Iran Namag, a quarterly of the Canadian Society of Iranian Studies. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work and prosper on their ancestral homeland. And of course, we're very grateful to Professor Geoffrey Haig, who has joined us to give us a wonderful lecture. Jeff is coming from the University of Bamberg. Next, my colleague, Professor Eric Ananbi, will be introducing Professor Haig, and he's also going to moderate the session. The title of the talk today's talk is Corpus-based Approaches to the Typology of Iranian Languages. Eric?
Yeah, well, thank you, Arslan, for your words of introduction, and you're welcome to our guests. And today, for me, it's a real privilege to welcome Professor Geoffrey Haig as the fourth speaker in our public lecture series. Geoffrey Haig is Professor of Linguistics in the Institute of Oriental Studies at the University of Bamberg, Germany. And I first got to meet Jeff almost 10 years ago at the conference that he and the ICIL organizing team put together for us in the lovely city of Bamberg. A few years later, I had the privilege of returning there to carry out research on mapping and typology of Iranian languages with Jeff as my host. And from the beginning of our preparations to the moment we arrived, Jeff went out of his way to make me and my family feel at home in the town of Bamberg and at the university. And during our years there, Jeff invested in me as an early career scholar, shaped my thinking as a linguist, and helped me refine my methods in ways that continue to be central to my work. So I have a personal debt. And today I'm honored to return the favor in a small way and to welcome him out of sabbatical to be a guest speaker today here in our Iranian Linguistics lecture series, which is hosted by the Iranian linguistics community here in my home in Canada. And so since the publication of his prize-winning dissertation, Alignment Change in Iranian Languages, a construction grammar approach, Jeff has been making waves in the world of Iranian linguistics, not afraid to think big in a discipline that's not always known for its openness to new ideas. His academic production is wide-ranging and substantial, always showing generous cross-fertilization between linguistic theory and language data. So today's topic, as Arslan mentioned, corpus-based approaches to the typology of Iranian languages, is both timely and significant. Whereas the fields of linguistic theory and linguistic typology have traditionally concentrated on pre-formulated or canned grammatical analysis, we're now on the edge of a disciplinary and technological threshold where we can gain insights into the function of natural language through production and analysis of oral text corpora in ways that haven't been possible until now. So today, Geoff will be talking to us about how corpus-based typology works, how these methods can be applied to Iranian languages. And this will include a review of his word order in West Asia dataset, and I trust a walk through the Hamadan Bamberg corpus of contemporary spoken Persian in particular. So please join me in welcoming Professor Geoffrey Haig.
Well, thank you so much for these very, very kind and welcoming words, Eric. There's, all I can say, it was a pleasure having you in Bamberg, and you know, I think that was a very fruitful collaboration, and I'm really glad that we've been able to carry on over the years. And yeah, this just is another link in a long chain. So thank you once again, and thanks to the organizers of this lecture series. I was just saying to Arsalan that actually, apart from Eric, I've not met any of the people here in person before. The organizers, I mean. I've just had a whole series of very friendly and efficient emails organizing this. So thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And yeah, I hope it's going to be of some benefit to you. I've actually given a few presentations recently on related stuff. So some of this will probably be quite familiar to some people in the audience. I can't really gauge what levels of familiarity there are. So I'm going to apologize for repeating myself at some point, but I have put in some new stuff, some very recent stuff here, and changed a little bit of the angle that I'm taking. And I hope I've taken out things that just sort of dragged on a bit, so that we will have some time for discussion. So without further ado, and I'm sorry if I'm not, you know, I was thinking I should go through a long list of thanking people, but that's even worse because you always forget someone and then it's like you offend somebody. So anyway, just thanks to everyone that was involved. Let me put it that way. Okay, so let's move to a screen share here, and it worked before, so I hope it's going to work again. Okay, so here is briefly what I'm going to be talking about today. So a little bit of introduction on word order, typology, and Iranian, then about the role of geography. And then I'm going to get to the core of the presentation, so corpus-based approaches to typology and WOWA, which is word order in Western Asia, the typological database that we're putting together. And then I'm looking at some work that we've done on that related to Iranian and other languages. And then I'll move on to conclusions. So if we look at word order in Iranian, I guess the sort of thing that's intrigued people from the start is the inconsistencies in it. Now, there's been a huge amount of research on this. Initially, the focus has been on Persian, Farsi, tacitly also standard Persian. It's a bit fuzzy at this point, what exactly is meant, but anyway, that's basically what's sort of assumed. And a range of theoretical frameworks. So there's a rich generative tradition summarized in the recent handbook in Samin Karimi's article. There's grammar-based typological work, which Professor Dabir Moghadam has summarized in the same handbook. More recently, there have been corpus-based and experimental approaches. Pega Fariri and Paulette Sambellion in Paris and associates have worked on that. And today I'm going to look at corpus-based approaches. So no shortage of previous research. And I just think, I hope that what we're going to talk about today will complement this. Now, as I said before, there's something intriguing about Persian syntax, and in effect, it carries over to most of West Iranian, at least the westernmost languages. We have a rare combination. So we have a head final verb phrase. So objects precede the verb. A little bit more about this later. And that coexists with head initial structures pretty well everywhere else. So in a noun, we have prepositions rather than postpositions. We have noun phrases that have post-nominal modifiers of various types, relative clauses, adjectives, possessors. Prepositional phrases all follow the lexical head. We've got head initial complement phrases, so the complementizers at the left edge, and then the clause comes. We've got matrix clauses that precede subordinate clauses. We've got a mix of auxiliary main verb ordering. This is fascinating. I mean, we have budan and shodan, which follow the main verb, but you've got the more recent auxiliary dashtan, which precedes it. You've got all modals preceding the main verbs. The whole thing looks head initial, except for this weird OV. That's quite unusual. Very few languages worldwide exhibit a comparable split between head final OV, so head final verb phrase, versus head initial rest of the syntax. And the few languages that do look like that are either related to Persian or spoken in the same area, so some varieties of Neo-Aramaic. Otherwise, this is worldwide pretty unusual. And it raises a whole host of questions. This kind of disharmonic word order that goes head final in the verb phrase and head initial everywhere else, is it a problem for language acquirers? Where did it come from in the first place? Is it stable diachronically? What impact has there been of contact languages? And so on and so on. So there's a whole bunch of questions, not the least of which concern how it's developed over time and how it continues to develop. So these are the questions that actually interest me. Okay. So this brings us to the role of geography. So let's suppose Persian is weird and West Iranian too because of where it's spoken. This is an idea that was developed by Don Stilo in a few papers in the early 2000s, but it actually goes back to his earlier work in the 1980s, 1990s, where he really pioneered the sort of aerial typology of Iranian languages. And what he says is that Western Iranian is typologically hybrid due to its location at the intersection of consistently head final Turkic and Indo-Aryan languages, so in the east and in the north, and consistently head initial Semitic, that is Afro-Asiatic languages in the west, so around the Mediterranean, for example, North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and so on. So very, very simplified at this point. The picture is something like Semitic, which is, so let's take Arabic, which is consistently prepositional, adjectives follow the noun, possessors follow the noun, and objects follow the verb. And in Turkic, we have the mirror image, we have postpositions, we have adjectives preceding the noun, possessors preceding the noun, and verbs follow the object. Now, if we go into Iranian, we can pick different West Iranian languages and we're going to get mixtures here. So if we go into Persian, we're going to find prepositions. But if we go up into Caspian, Mazandarani, and so on, we're going to get postpositions. And if we go into Vafsi or we go into Kurdish, we're going to get postpositions, prepositions, and circumpositions. So it's a real mix there. It's quite similar with the noun adjectives order, which can be mixed too, and the noun possessor order too. So depending on which West Iranian language you look at, you might get possessors in front of the noun, you might get them after the noun, you might go in different varieties of Baluchi where you get both. Where we do seem to get some stability is in the order of object and verb, where Iranian patterns pretty much identically with Turkic. And this is historically how it's been. Turkic was always OV as far as we know, and Iranian was 2. So we can assume that that hasn't changed much, but we'll have a look at that more closely. So this was Don Stilo's idea that from a very sort of bird's eye perspective, West Iranian sitting on the cusp of Iranian, sandwiched, as it were, between Turkic and Indo-Aryan on the one side and Afro-Asiatic and the Western branches of Indo-European on the other. And over time, that has led to a hybridization of the syntax. So this is the broad idea behind that, and we'll explore the implications in the rest of the talk. So the geography answer to the question of how did Persian get the way it is, or how do we get this mix in West Iranian generally, is something like this. Wherever any structure in Iranian exhibits variability in head directionality, so where you're going to get both prepositions and postpositions, or you're going to get adjectives preceding the noun in some varieties and following it in another. So wherever you get that variability, the head initial structures are more likely to occur in those varieties with greater proximity to and intensity of contact with Semitic languages. So this is how I would roughly formulate the tendency that I think Don Stilo was trying to pin down. I don't know if Don would agree with me on this, but that's how I do it for the time being anyway. Okay. How does this look from a sort of a micro perspective? Well, I'm just going to give you one example of this. This is from Northern Kurdish. So Northern Kurdish is a reasonably coherent bundle of varieties that with a high degree of mutual intelligibility. Fair enough to call it a single language, I think, perhaps even a dialect of Kurdish, but it's not hugely diverse internally. If you look at the way people say something like, I said to him, so I'm just interested in how this to him gets coded in context, in combination with the verb say or tell, which is guten, which is obviously the cognate to Persian guftan. So there's 3 possibilities. You can have a preposition as in the first one. So mengut bui, where you have a preposition bu. You can have a circumposition where you have something that looks like a preposition in front, je, and you have something that looks kind of like a postpositional particle after as well. So they wrap around the noun, juira or jira. Or you can go fully postpositional, where all you have is the postpositional particle. That's this one down here, wira, and that's the variety of Elbistan. So you've got 3 possibilities. You've got preposition, you've got a circumposition, or you've got a postposition to mark exactly the same constituent with exactly the same verb. Now, if we look at geography, it becomes a little clearer why we have that. So those 3 varieties I talked about, this is a map taken from the Manchester database of Kurdish dialects project, organized and put together by Yaron Matras and associates. So each of these little squares is one of the data points in his database there. It's basically some variety of Kurdish. And if we look for those 3 varieties that I just told you about, the postpositional one is here, Elbistan. That's the data point here. You can see just by eyeballing the map that this is peripheral, right? This is on the edge of the Kurdish speech zone. And by virtue of that, it's also most exposed to, historically and today as well, obviously, to influence from Turkish and historically from Armenian. And both of these languages are, of course, postpositional. So in a sense, it makes fair amount of sense that if any variety of Kurdish is going to flip to postpositional, it's going to be the ones that are the outliers from the rest of the nesting effect of the rest of Kurdish, and that are correspondingly have greater exposure to other languages which happen to be postpositional. The prepositional one is here, Sheikhan. So that's North Iraq. And you can see it's right in the heart of the southeasternmost part of Northern Kurdish. And it's in a place where Arabic has been spoken for centuries, but perhaps most importantly, Neo-Aramaic was spoken here for a couple of thousand years. So Kurdish and Neo-Aramaic have been extremely close. This is the project that I'm working on now in Cambridge with the Aramaicist, and the degree of contact is quite amazing, actually. So that's our prepositional one. And again, it ties in with what I said, the preposition. So the head initial structure is found precisely where contact with Semitic languages is most intense. And finally, we have the bingo structure up here, which were circumpositions, the mixed one. This is actually pretty much the norm for most of the bulk of Northern Kurdish up here. It's historically, clearly, these two are linked. The postpositional one and the circumpositional one are essentially the same. It's just that the postpositional one lost the preposition and kept the postpositional part. So the break is actually between these two here and this one down here, which is prepositional. And this is, all you have to do is look at a map of Neo-Aramaic. That's a map of traditional locations where Neo-Aramaic was spoken for centuries and centuries and centuries throughout the region. Most of them have gone now, but if you lay the map of Neo-Aramaic over the map of Kurdish, you get massive overlap. Basically, the entire southeastern or the central block of Kurdish was spoken for millennia in a Neo-Aramaic, deeply influenced Neo-Aramaic speech zone. So I don't find it that implausible that head initial structures would be most strongly concentrated down in this part. And in most, by and large, that's true. I don't think it's really any question about that. So that's a little bit of background on the role of geography. Now, let's come back to language typology, and let's talk a little bit about methods. So I'm just assuming some familiarity with language typology. I don't know if that was wise of me, but let's, the idea of language typology is, as the name says, to compare languages essentially without any borders. So every language you can find. There's no reason to restrict the scope of language typology. In fact, you should cast your net as wide as possible, because we're interested in what human language can look like. And if we want to do that, we'd want to know, we'd want to include as many languages as possible in our sample. But I'm not so much interested in sampling and so on at the moment. I'm more interested in what you actually compare and how you go about comparing it. So traditionally, language typology, starting with the work by Joseph Greenberg in the 1960s, has been feature-based, and it looks at ways of classifying languages based on their structure. So the idea is you end up with a set of classes of languages based on structural features that they have. So very simply, we might have a class of prepositional languages, and it would include Arabic, it would include Samoan, it would include Welsh, it would include Spanish, and hundreds, thousands of other languages. Okay, that's fine. And we call that the class of prepositional languages. And we call another class perhaps non-configurational languages, and another class has rich agreement languages, and so on. How do we get the information? Well, we go into descriptive grammars, we go into specialized literature surveys, we pick out what we think is the information we need, and we assign the feature to that language. This is somewhat simplified what's done. And you end up with a categorical feature assignment, and then you end up with a bunch of languages that you can't assign because the grammars don't give you the right information, or conflicting information, or the language does it various ways. And then you'll have a dustbin category, non-classifiable. So that's one way of doing it, and it's served us pretty well. And language typology has been a very, very rich and fertile field of linguistics for decades, and continues to be so. But there are certain problems, especially with the idea of assigning languages to discrete categories. So an alternative has been developed in the last 10, 15 years, which is not language-based, but it's corpus-based. So rather than go into the grammar of a language that somebody has written about that language, you take a chunk of natural speech data from that language. And obviously it needs some markup. We're not quite there yet. Artificial intelligence hasn't helped us so much in analyzing very small languages, but I'm sure we'll get there. I won't, but somebody will. And from that chunk of usage, you can extract probabilistic statements based on frequency and distribution of tokens in actual usage. So this is also called token-based typology, as opposed to construction or feature-based. So the idea would be that rather than assign a language to a discrete class, you assign a language to a gradient value, perhaps 65% OV, and another language is 70%, so on. So very simply, this is the idea, and I've talked about this before. I'll just give you a slightly different example, though it's possibly more technical for at this time. So the feature-based typology, as I say, it's fairly well, it's the best known, and I'm sure many people are familiar with it. The best known examples, if you want to look into feature-based, traditional grammar feature-based typology, is certainly the Walls database, Dreyer and Husbermat. More recently, a more sophisticated approach is autotype, which is definitely worth looking at, and that's fine. But corpus-based typology, as I said, we replace language by corpus. We replace features through metrics that we have to define, extracted from corpora, and categorical values are replaced by gradient values. So some of the people that have been influential in developing this, certainly Bernard Weichli, Futrell, and a group of authors who've developed corpora for this, the so-called universal dependencies corpora, Natalia Levshina. We've worked on spoken language corpus-based typology. That's, I guess, what I've been doing a lot the last 10 years. So it's a rapidly growing field anyway. Now, let's have a look at how corpus-based typology would actually work in practice. So to do this, I've given you an example. This is the old and famous prodrop feature, okay? So we know just by looking at Persian and by looking at English, one way that they differ a great deal is that in English, you don't have a lot of choice about whether you're going to use a subject pronoun or not. You've mostly got to use one. In Persian, you have a lot more freedom. You can drop the pronoun, okay? You can just say mihoram, and everybody knows what's meant. You can't actually say that in English. So this degree of variation is a nice locus or a nice field for looking at language typology and the differences between languages. And it has been very, very intensely researched for, a good 40, 50 years now. So let's call the possibility of dropping a subject, let's call it prodrop, because that's a fairly conventional term, and it's also the shortest one to put on my slides. And let's say some languages will drop lots of pronouns, so Persian, and let's say some languages won't drop many, and that would be English. And somewhere between them or around them, we've got a lot of other languages that might do it more or less. So in the early days, there used to be a simple binary distinction between prodrop languages, which turned out to be things like Italian and Spanish, and non-prodrop languages, which didn't let you drop the pronouns, and that was French and English. But since then, things have got a lot more sophisticated, and we've moved into it. So Anders Holmberg and his colleagues have been working on this for a long time and have increasingly refined and developed the typology. So most recently, and this has probably got more refined since, I haven't kept up with this, but one typology that's quite widely cited is in terms of 4 classes of languages. So there's no prodrop languages, that would be English. There's partial prodrop languages, for which Finnish is regularly cited. There's consistent pro-drop languages. This apparently is Persian, but also Italian and many others. And then there's radical or discourse pro-drop languages. And they, you know, anything goes. I mean, that's not quite the truth, but so that would be Mandarin, for example, and a number of languages of mainland Southeast Asia. Thai and Vietnamese would also be in that group. Now, these types, there are quite elaborate and refined definitions for each of these 4 types. I probably won't go into all the definitions, all the criterial features here, because some of them get quite complicated. It's about the interpretation of pronouns in context, how you're going to actually decide what the pronoun would be referring to, and depending on the language type, it might only be able to refer to an immediately preceding noun, or it might be able to refer to something a bit further away, and so on and so on. So it's actually a pretty interesting field to dive into. And these different classes have been increasingly refined and so on and so on. So I won't go through them all, but you get the idea, I think. So you've got 4 classes here. At the bottom, you've got this discourse radical, no person-based restrictions, control and not local or non-local, unrestricted. Oh, there's a typo there. It should be unrestricted with regard to person values. And these languages generally don't have verbal agreement. Okay. So that's conventional typology. Okay, we set up 4 types, we define them, we refine the definitions, we keep refining them, we decide is language A belong to type 3 or type 4, we debate about that, and so on and so on. So on it goes. Okay, what would a corpus-based typological approach to this do? The corpus-based typological approach is a bit simpler in a sense. It's more complicated in other ways. The corpus-based typological approach would be, well, let's take a corpus and let's see actually what happens, how often and under what condition pronouns are going to be realized. So we've done this for 15 languages that we have in a data set called multicast, which is multilingual corpus of annotated spoken text. So these are not Iranian language. There's a couple of Iranian languages in there. They're just a spread of diverse languages across the world that we've been collecting over 10 years. And we've gone through, and we could do this automatically because of the annotation. We're able to figure out what's the rate of dropping pronouns. So how many of the, where you'd expect a pronoun is 0, and given it a figure. And we've also split it according to person. So we've looked at first, second person. These are the red triangles. We've looked at third person human. These are the green diamonds there. And we've looked at third person non-human. And the picture that we get is this, which is a little bit busy, but I'll walk you through this. So the first thing you see is it would be difficult to decide on 4 different classes here, right? There's no obvious way that these languages fall into classes. You see a lot of difference, but it's kind of messy and it's kind of gradual. So on the left-hand side, we have English, and you can see very low values for 0 pronouns, okay? So most of the pronouns are overt and the number of 0 pronouns is very low. And at the other end of the scale, we have, this is Cypriot Greek, massive numbers of 0 pronouns. Persian, by the way, is also very high here. So these are the languages where subject pronouns, this is all about subjects, get left out a lot. And then in the middle, we get this sort of, a lot of intermediate stuff. So at first sight, it looks messy, right? But actually, there's a generalization you can already recognize here that goes across all languages. So I don't know if you see that straight away. If you do, go ahead and tell me. So anybody wants to hit their speak button should go ahead and tell me what they notice here. it's
There,
the key is this: it's the split according to humanness and person. Yeah.
There's sort of an implicational hierarchy, right? Like it looks like if you drop, first person, like if you drop first person, then you would drop third person humans, and then you would drop third person non-human. So there's an order, there's a hierarchy in terms of which ones you would drop more, basically.
Yeah, thank you, Hassan. So I'm really glad that this is not as opaque as I thought it would be. So that's exactly the point. This is not entirely, I mean, some people have suggested this for some languages, but at least one language is claimed to run counter to this, and that's Finnish. But I probably won't get to talk about that today. But the idea here you can see is pretty well everywhere, and I'll come back to this in a minute, pretty well everywhere, the lowest levels of pronoun dropping are the first and second person, and the highest levels are the third person non-human. Okay, it's not fully consistent. So English, for example, bucks the trend here. Persian, there's a problem with the corpus here because there's hardly any first, second person pronouns in the corpus. That's why that's a bit weird. But otherwise, so for example, this one here, Northern Kurdish, there's a huge difference. That's probably due to the ergativity in Northern Kurdish, which wipes the person agreement on the verb. Other languages down here, these are oceanic languages, Iran, Tiop, same tendency. So this is kind of exciting, and it's a different kind of typological generalization. We're not putting them into classes. There's no class here. We're just saying there's a generalization that we can extract from the data. We didn't expect it. We didn't formulate it. When it's something like there will, non-human third-person subjects will never be more frequently deleted than, first, second-person subjects will never be more frequently deleted than third-person non-humans. There's various ways you could do this, but the idea is that there's a person effect here, and we can see it when we do this kind of pretty straightforward corpus-based analysis. Now, of course, what gets lost here are all the subtleties of different clause types, different positions, where's the controller, and so on and so on. It's gone here. Okay, this is a very, very, very simple, but still at this level of coarseness, certain generalizations can be found. Now, I'll just show you the same thing for objects, because we've done the same for objects, and there it's actually even more so. The person effect gets much stronger here. So look at those blue triangles there. They're all the non-human third singulars. They get dropped everywhere, right? And those first, second person pronouns, they get maintained when they're objects. So this person effect that we're looking here actually gets amplified for objects. Now, there's nothing that I'm aware of in pro-drop literature generally that would predict this effect. Of course, the sample's small, and when we expand it, it may just evaporate. I don't know. But this is how we move in corpus-based typology. We haven't formulated a set of categories that we're looking for, classes. We're exploring the data, seeing what happens, and then generating a hypothesis from it. So a hypothesis that we would generate from this is that that person values actually make a pretty big difference, and there's quite a consistent cross-linguistic trend here. So, okay, this is just to illustrate what you can do with corpus-based typology. And here are some of the principles. So basically, we work bottom up. So we have minimal initial assumptions. Coding categories are kept simple, though informed by typological practice. We follow a principle of late aggregation. So rather than having predefined and complex classifications, so partial prodrop or whatever, generalizations emerge from the analysis, as do initial analysis categories, as well as novel research questions. And the third point is that we're pretty much committed to open science. So all this data, this multicast data, is available online, and you can check it out. And these are principles that other people, it's not me just making this up. These are pretty much following the lead of the autotype approach to typology of Balthasar Bickel and Associates, which you can also visit online. Okay, so that's what you can do with a corpus. What does a corpus look like? Well, you've got to think about how you want to annotate it. You know, you've got some recorded speech and you need to make some sort of representation of it that would be in principle amenable to a quantitative analysis. And there's basically two ways you can go on this. You can either do a comprehensive annotation, means you annotate, let's say, all the words in the corpus or all the morphemes if you want. And you use some annotation scheme, and then later you can run it. You can derive generalizations over these annotations. So this is what we've done in multicast, what I showed you, and it's also what we've done in the Hambam corpus. And I'm going to try and get that up on my screen. I'm going to have to stop this one, and let me go back here. And it worked before, so can you see that now?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so this is a corpus that we've put together, and I'll quickly go so you see the people. These are the people who've worked on this. It's a collaboration between the University of Bamberg and the University of Hamadan in Iran, and we've collected, recorded, or these people that you can see on the screen have collected and recorded and transcribed and annotated and translated a pretty decent chunk of contemporary spoken unscripted Persian. And here's the list of the individual texts in there. So they're all in there together with the annotation files. You can download it. There's a WAV file here. There's an MP3 here. This is the Elan file where all the annotation was done. This is an XML version or a tab separated values version. And we can also preview it. So I can go into, I'll get one of these. These are one of my favorites. So this is a preview of one of the texts in our corpus of contemporary spoken Persian. You can do it online. You get each utterance in this form. You get the utterance itself, you get the formal form of the utterance, you get grammatical words, morphological glosses, you get some annotation that I won't go into, and you get some idiomatic translation. So here it is, annotation, utterance by utterance. So let's see if we can hear this. Okay, did you hear that?
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, we can carry on. Okay. And so on. So you can preview every utterance that's in the corpus, and you'll get the full annotation here for that. And you can download it. You can do whatever you like with it. It's completely unrestrictedly accessible. This is what I mean with open science. And we're continuing to build up this corpus. So my friends and colleagues in Hamadan are continuing to work on additional texts. And this list here is going to get longer. Okay, so that's a list of the texts that are in there. So this is comprehensive annotation of spoken language data that can feed into corpus-based typology. Okay, now given the time restrictions, I should go back to my slides. And I hope I can do that. So I hope you got my slides now. Just complain if you haven't.
Thanks, we got it, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So that was an example of a comprehensive annotation, and that was from this corpus. And if you want the link from that, I can put it in the chat later. But that's a huge amount of work. Okay, so this comprehensive annotation is just mind-numbingly labor intensive. So is there a cheaper way? Yes, there is. And that's targeted coding, which means instead of coding or annotating every unit in the text, you target those tokens that you're interested in. So this is what we've done for another data set. That's Warwa, the word order in Western Asia. And a Warwa data set looks like this. If I'm going to get this coming down, yeah. So Warwa's got 25 subcorpora, so roughly that's growing. Most of them are Iranian languages. There's an aerial focus on Western Asia. As I said, it's targeted rather than comprehensive annotation. These texts are quite small. It's all spoken language though. And we've coded only tokens in the text that we're interested in. That happens to be non-subject constituents for reasons that will become apparent. So just have a quick look into a data set there. Whoops, that's what a completely coded data set looks like in Warwa. Here's the text that goes down here. This is Turkmenistan Baluchi. That's each utterance unit in the text. That's the translation. That's the token we're interested in. So here, 3 sons. And then it's coded according to a set of values that we're interested in, and so on and so on. You go through the text and you come up with the tokens you're interested in. You don't have an annotated version of the whole text, but you could do it later because you've got a parallel text here. And again, that is online available. So that's what we've done for these languages here. This is what we call the doculinks. This is a map showing the distribution of data sets that we have in Warwa. So Iranian are the red diamonds, Turkic are the blue dots. This is something you better note because it comes up in a couple of graphics later. This is Semitic, and then there's other, which are mostly various languages of the Caucasus. Now, okay, so I'm coming to the last bit of my talk and just showing you what we do with Warwa and coming back to the questions I started at the beginning. So the first one is I said Persian and generally West Iranian is OV in its word order, so objects precede verbs. Is that true at the level of corpus frequency as well? So do we get variability there? Because I mean, it's one thing to say Persian is OV based on, standard language and people's perhaps norms that are influencing what they produce when you ask them. It's another thing to actually look at corpus data. So this is the result of an analysis of OV and VO word order in West Iranian, Turkic, and Semitic language. And I hope I'm going to get that in there. Oh yeah, it's coming. Okay. So what we've done is simply counted the numbers. So we get all the direct objects, and then we work out the proportion that are post-verbal. Okay. So a high proportion is the right-hand side here, and a low proportion is the left. And these are the languages we've looked at. There's a mix here of Turkic, Iranian, and Semitic. So let's start with the easy bit. Here's our Semitic languages, right? High proportion of post-verbal objects. That's not a big surprise, right? Semitic languages are VO historically, and in corpora, that's what they are too. So that's like 80% plus VO. The red dots are the Iranian languages. And this is actually, for me, very surprising. There's not that much variation here either. Even in corpus levels, most objects are in front of the verb. So the levels of post-verbal objects is low. We're down here at, between 0 and 10%. So less than 10%. So it's like 90% OV, even in corpus. With the exception of this one here, this is Tat, but it's Caucasian Tat. That's a slightly different story. Then we've got this, and the blue ones are Turkic. Again, that's what we'd expect, except for this one. This is a Turkic language spoken in Moldavia. So if I go back to the map, there it is here. So you see why geography counts, right? This is the absolute outlier in our OV counts for Turkish, and it's geographically the one that is cut off from the bulk of Turkic languages and surrounded by Indo-European, Slavic, and Romance languages. So that's the story of this blue dot here. That's Gagauz Turkic. So Iranian is pretty consistently OV at the level of corpus frequency as well, which is kind of surprising given the amount of contact with Semitic, okay? So here's Iranian, here's Semitic, and they're worlds apart. Now, what that tells me is that OV is historically very stable. But if you split objects into pronominal objects and nominal objects, the picture gets a bit more interesting. And briefly, what happens? So the round ones here are nominal objects, like I saw the man, right? And the square ones are pronominal objects, as in I saw him, okay? And what do you see? You see that the Semitic languages front pronominal objects a lot, okay? They really make excessive use of fronted object pronouns, whereas the nominal stay back. With Iranian, it's the opposite. It's the pronominal objects that go behind the verb, okay? And in effect, the convergence happens there. It happens with pronouns, not with nouns. There's one language here that really, really sort of breaks the mold, right? This is Kumzari. So Kumzari has pretty consistent preverbal nominal objects, but as soon as you have a pronoun, it's way, way more likely to be after the verb. So what's going on in Kumzari? Well, again, it's a question of geography. If we go back to our map, Kumzari is down here. And this data is thanks to a wonderful documentation by Christina van der Waal-Annenbeek. And in her dissertation, she's produced rich, rich text collections, which were perfect corpus. But you can see what's going on here, right? It's actually spoken on the other side of the Gulf. And it's been surrounded by centuries by Southern Arabian dialects. And that pull of objects behind the verb is, I think, undeniably related to the fact that this has been heavy, heavy Semitic influence for centuries. So that's the story with pronominal objects. And the final thing I'm going to look at, and I'm sorry for people who've heard this before, what about other verbal arguments? So we've talked about verbs and objects here, but there are other, verbs can have other arguments, right? They can have indirect objects, they could have goals, they could have sources, they could have all sorts of things. The widely held assumption is that if objects are on one side of the verb, other objects, so if direct objects are one side of the verb, other objects should be too, right? We would expect that sort of a unified head directionality in the verb phrase with everything stacking up neatly on the same side of the verb. And for standard Persian, this is the impression you get. So here's an example. We've got a direct object here, kitabu. We've got the indirect object here, Maryam, and then we've got a locational here, dar khune, and they all stack up da 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 in front of the finite verb. So this is standard Persian, and it's verb final in the sense that everything can at least stack up on the same side of the verb. What does it look like when you look at actual texts that are produced by speakers spontaneously? Well, I'm only going to look at one type of other argument here because it gets very messy. The only type I'm looking at, they're also the most frequent type, is spatial goals. So I went to the city, or I put the money on the table, these types of things. They're relatively easy to identify. It's not a big deal there. And let's see how they pattern. So let's start by looking at the same visualization we had before about direct objects. So that's the direct object one we had here, Iranian and Semitic down here. Iranian and Turkic down here, Semitic here. If we now take the same languages and look at their goals, we get this picture. So what I'm saying here is, yeah, the direct objects can happily be tucked away to the left of the verb, the goals will drift rightwards. And if you look down here, you actually see that the Semitic languages and the Iranian languages are no longer distinguished. So at this point, the values for post-verbal goals lock in with the neighboring languages, which happen to be Semitic. So this is what I call the rightward drift of goals, and we've been working on this for a while, but this gives you a sort of visualization of what's happening. You can see it doesn't have, Turkic is not as goal postposing happy as Iranian. That's something you can see here. Iranian has really moved a lot here. It's not all of Iranian. And if we want to look and see where are these languages, these ones here, that really go full on putting their goals behind the verb. If we look at that on a map, it looks something like this. These are the languages that do it. And I've put black rings around them here to give you an idea. And you can see that basically they cluster in this area here, which we might call Mesopotamia. I put a sort of a crude ring around it, and you will recognize that's our old Neo-Aramaic region, basically. It's the Semitic sphere of influence. And there doesn't seem to be much question again that what's going on here, however we want to model it or whatever theoretical assumptions we might have, it must surely be related to the Semitic languages that were spoken here over centuries and in a very, very close contact with Iranian at the time for years. So these are all varieties of Kurdish, and they've all, so here they are here, and they've all flipped to having post-verbal goals in the overwhelming majority of contexts. Not 100%, but we're getting up 70, 80, 90% there, which is practically as good as categorical. Okay, so coming back to the slide we had at the beginning about the role of geography, we can add verb goal order here, which is not a standard parameter in typology. And at least for those Mesopotamian varieties of Iranian, this is what you get. You get a sharing of verb goal order with Semitic, and with some of Turkic as well. Actually, this is not completely true. The Turkic ones are mixed. They don't get to 70, 80%. They're something like 60, 70, something like that. But roughly what happens at this point, the Semitic pattern spreads to basically unite the rest of the languages spoken in that region. So this is kind of the crudest way I can get this over at this point, glossing over a lot of details, but I hope you get the picture. Okay, so I'm going to finish now. So my conclusions, well, obviously a lot of details need to be explored, but it seems inescapable that the geography factor has been powerful in shaping West Iranian word order and many other aspects of its typology. So Eric, you've worked on pharyngalization in phonology and written about that very convincingly for Kumzari. And you know, a similar point can be made for the syntax as well. So shifts and differences may be gradient rather than categorical in nature. And if they are, then they'll slip below the radar of conventional grammatical analysis, which is actually based mostly on isolated sentences. And it's precisely these kinds of low-level frequency variation which may be the most sensitive indicators for areal influence. So shifts in frequency are the precursors, if you like, for the grammaticalization of structure. And finally, corpus-based methodologies are an appropriate tool to capture and interpret these gradient phenomena, just as they are for historical linguistics. So that's all I have to say. I've talked a bit longer than I wanted, but I hope we still have enough time for discussion.